Good morning. My name's Maria McNamara and I'm the CEO of advance.org. This morning I'm with Adam Malouf, who's the Chief Asset Sourcing Officer at the Knowledge Fund in the Government of Dubai. He's also Chair of the Middle East Advisory Committee for the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a board member of Trade and Investment for the Australia Business Council in Dubai. And he's on the Management Committee member and strategic advisor for the New South Wales chapter of the Australia Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Welcome. How are you, Adam?
Good, Maria. How are you? Good afternoon.
Oh, thank you. I'm really well. It's Monday and the weather is beautiful and we had a lovely weekend. So it's great to be with you today.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Now, Adam, you've had 20 years of experience as a C-suite executive and non-executive director, and you've worked in multiple geographies and industries. And you've also had a high degree of cross-border and experience and obviously cultural awareness. And your focus is very much on finance, management, strategy, and governance. You've found yourself in Dubai. Tell me a little bit about what path you took to arrive there.
So the path started a while ago, and I did my education in Australia. I did the 2 degrees, Commerce and Law at the University of New South Wales. I then worked for a few years in private legal practice, focusing on banking and finance, real estate, funds management, and capital markets. Around 2004, I was looking to move overseas. It was always my intention to do that. I looked at a few places. I looked at London, New York, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then Dubai came onto my radar. And I thought, this is interesting. And I knew a bit about the place from what you read in the press and what you read in terms of general knowledge. So there was a particular role here, and I actually flew over to see what the place was like, having only transited through there previously. And I was sold. I was sold basically by a couple of things. In a few days, I recognised that they have very much a can-do attitude. They had a lot in terms of growth aspirations. And that was it. And 16 years later, give or take, I'm still here. And I think what I saw back then still holds true today. I mean, it is a truly global city. It's at the crossroads between East and West. But what they've done here in particular is that they've encouraged and created an environment which encourages free trade, low cost of doing business, sensible regulation, and open dealings between government, private sector, business associations, and other entities in the corporate ecosystem.
It seems like an environment that's very open and welcoming of business. Talk to me a little bit more about your current role and the impact that you're making in that role.
So, Maria, my current role, it's called Chief Asset Sourcing Officer, but essentially I'm Chief Investment Officer for one of the government sovereign wealth funds. And like most sovereign wealth funds, the aim is to diversify deployment of liquidity to generate sustainable returns. But in our case, because we've focused historically on education and also real estate, and increasingly we're branching out into other asset classes and sectors, what we do has a resounding impact. So when you talk about education, you're looking not only education in terms of early learning, K-12, higher education, but you're talking more broadly about what I call knowledge propagation, building the leaders of tomorrow to be more resilient. And particularly in these very challenging times, that is becoming more and more important.
So, Adam, when you're looking at the lessons that you've learned from being in this role, what would they be?
Well, in this role in particular, and I think it's probably the same for the other roles that I've been in, I think that there are probably 5 key lessons. The first one is to be pragmatic and forthright, but also be respectful in your communication. you need to have multiple backup plans and contingencies, prepare for the unexpected as much as you can. You need to be able to, speak from a position of strength, but in doing that, having done your research very thoroughly. Something also that's critical is deliver good news, but also know how to deliver bad news. There's nothing worse than papering over the bad news, because eventually it will come back to haunt you. And finally, I think the most important thing is, and some people neglect this, it's you need to build friendships, but not friendships that are a means to an end. Friendships that don't have an agenda, because that is the foundation upon which relationships are fundamentally built here.
That's really interesting, because they're universal lessons, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And the same is here. The same applies here. It's no different. You've got a melting pot of people from every part of the world here. And so it's not homogenous by any stretch of the imagination. So what applies in Australia, the US, Europe, Asia, it's the same here.
And the difference that you're making as an Australian, and as an Australian with an Arabic heritage, the difference you're making in Dubai?
I would like to think that what I do here as an Australian, and what I have done, it does a couple of things. It strengthens the bond between the two countries, not just the two countries, but Australia and the Middle East, and more particularly the Gulf region. I think also the difference that I make is, and others make, is that we try to find areas of common interest. And also, I think that it's important to point out that most Australians have a very straightforward and candid attitude, whether it's in social circles or in business. People like that here. People like to know, upfront the way things are, the way you're thinking. That's critical. So there's no hidden agendas, there's no ulterior motives. And I think also, it's finding pragmatic solutions, not esoteric or vague or theoretical solutions to problems. That's what they need here. That's how we can add value in terms of what we do every day.
And what best describes the community that you have working around you, the expat community that you work with each day to achieve these goals?
There's probably a few ways to describe the community here. It's very close-knit. There are about, give or take, 15,000 Australians in the UAE and about 300 Australian companies that have a presence here. Everyone, from what I've seen, is willing to help each other, whether it's socially or professionally. And that's within the community. But also there is a willingness to work with other expat communities, and also with relevant local and federal government entities. The interesting thing here is that there's no concept of I'm from New South Wales, or I'm from Victoria, or I'm from Queensland. We're all Australian. And unless it's state of origin time, when there can be a bit of rivalry, everyone's the same, and that's the attitude that everyone has.
It's that unity of purpose is very strong when you're overseas, and we certainly saw that here during the COVID crisis, when we were all pulling together as a nation to flatten the curve. So it's very powerful. Talking about COVID and the impact it's had on our economy, which is not insignificant, what is the state of the economy where you are?
As a preliminary comment, the trade and investment relationship between Australia is long-standing. It goes back 40 years, and it's a relationship that's probably worth around 30 billion Australian dollars when you factor in investment and trade as well. The economy here, like every economy around the world, has been impacted by COVID. And the government here, like many other governments around the world, have stepped in and provided stimulus at a number of levels. Probably as at March, the stimulus here was around 100 billion Australian dollars. Now that's just from the central bank. That doesn't include support from different emirate level governments, the federal government itself, and the various free zone authorities. So you could probably add about 20 or 30% to that in terms of total support. That's actually quite significant for a country that only has 9 million people. To provide that level of support, it illustrates the importance of the UAE as a hub for the region and other parts of the world.
And
the support.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
How has that money been invested?
Yeah, so the money has been invested in a number of ways. There's support provided for SMEs, there's support provided to the banks, and the mandate is, look, here's some interest-free money, help your customers, give them deferments, give them waivers, restructure their loans, help them as much as you can. And also, in terms of what the free zone authorities have done, for example, rent-free periods, waivers of license and registration and visa fees, for example. They're the general ways in which the money has been applied.
So if you were looking for opportunities by finding problems to solve where you are now, and you're an Australian entrepreneur, where would you be looking? What problems are important to the government and what problems are waiting to be solved?
I think that the problems that are waiting to be solved, and also factoring in the medium to long-term vision, there's probably a few areas where Australian companies can make a difference and are making a difference now. And there is no shortage of opportunities. So COVID has just, increased the universe of opportunities that are available. There's probably a few areas. So technology is a concept that underpins everything that's done here. The country here is subscribed to the fourth industrial revolution as a pillar of its growth for the next 50 years. So anything that touches on a technology stack, whether it's to do with education, the medical field, finance, property, anything that can make processes and procedures and systems more efficient and effective, and therefore reduce costs, is welcome. When you look at financial services, funds management is something that Australia does very well. I mean, we have, I think, the third or fourth largest pool of super money in the world. It's not just the funds, the commercial, the front office aspect. It's the rigor in governance and risk and compliance, right, which is critical for the survival of that type of business. If you look in healthcare, Australia is very good at facility and patient management systems, healthcare infrastructure, but also, more importantly, medical research, and partnerships here, I think, would be welcomed in that regard. I touched on education before, and that's a very broad sphere, but I think in particular, vocational education and training, corporate training, and research capabilities, particularly those that come out of some of our universities in Australia, which is still at a very nascent stage here. And I suppose the last area would be transport. I mean, Australia is very good at complex infrastructure. Yes. And given the size of the country, we are very well versed in this, whether it's roads, rail, or other forms of public and private transport.
And are we talking about all of those fantastic opportunities? I'm sitting here going through the list of high growth companies that could easily tap into all of those. Are these collaborations that are joint ventures that are as the best model, or are they very much investment opportunities where government and sovereign wealth funds and individuals would invest in Australian companies? And if so, what's the best way to go about raising funds? What sort of insights would you want to share with startups and scale-ups?
Yeah, look, I mean, there are a number of structures that you can use, whether it's a joint venture, a public-private partnership. The critical thing is to choose the right partner, whether that's government, a private company, or a group of private individuals. But in terms of raising funds, I mean, there's probably three discrete pools of funding. I mean, you've got the sovereigns, you've got family offices, and you've got venture capital funds as well. I mean, each of those has its own risk appetite, asset allocation, sector exposure requirements. Sovereigns are traditionally focused on income generation because they have a long-term view. But a lot of them also have special situations arms that look at direct investments and opportunities that are probably relatively more speculative. Family offices, obviously because there's a patriarch or a matriarch controlling that, they could be a bit more nimble in terms of getting things done because there's less bureaucracy, but also that comes with other considerations because, you know, within families there are different agendas, different competing tensions. So you've got to bear that in mind as well. VCs are quite nascent in this part of the world, but they are growing rapidly, and there has been a number of funding rounds from these VCs for some, you know, well-known companies in the region, which others outside the region would know. The pool of funding is not as big as other parts of the world, unless it's attached to government. And there are some arms of government that have been set up as specific venture capital entities, and they have that mandate to invest that pool of money in that way, and it's separate from the core investment aims of a sovereign fund or of a family office, for example.
So there's a couple of questions there. Just recently, Warwick Kramer has returned from Luxembourg, where he set up the corporate innovation arm for Vodafone. Is there much happening in terms of corporate innovation as investors?
There is a fair bit happening. I mean, there are a number of accelerators here which are supported by the government and semi-government authorities. There are innovation funds linked to government which provide funding for startups and for, you know, pre-Series A, Series A funding rounds. So there is that ecosystem here. And even within some of the financial free zones, they have, similar to Australia and other parts of the world, you know, what they call, you know, regulatory sandboxes where companies can set up. It's low touch regulation. They can, you know, essentially try before they buy into the regulatory regime, and therefore have a, you know, a higher standard imposed upon them in terms of governance and oversight. So there are means by which companies can actually raise money and also have the rigor of governance and regulation come in at the same time as they're raising that money. And so those two tracks move very smoothly concurrently as they grow, and eventually they look at a larger exit by way of an IPO or a trade sale.
So when you were talking about the other forms of investment in terms of family offices and the sovereign wealth funds, you mentioned earlier the importance of investing in relationship. And the cultural, in many cases, when you're talking about the Middle East, it is the relationship, it is the trust that is built between people. How would you suggest that companies and individuals go about, or what have you learnt from being there? How have you developed your relationships? Over what period of time? What sort of commitment needs to be shown?
Yeah, everything here is built on trust and relationships and rapport. Anyone who has a transactional mindset here, it doesn't get very far. And also, yeah, Australian and other companies have, you know, well-tuned areas of expertise, and that is great, but it's the way in which you communicate that expertise. You know, foisting it on someone here and saying, well, look, I'm from Australia, therefore I know more than you, is not going to work. It's about being collaborative. It's about taking it slowly. You know, you want to develop a partnership that's based on mutual respect, because, you know, believe it or not, you will learn a few things from people in this part of the world in terms of how to do things. I mean, look, there are the general challenges around different work practice, different ethical and moral behaviour, different legal and regulatory frameworks. That's, you know, in any part of the world that you're dealing with, and it's similar here. What is is important to recognise, and sort of touched on this earlier, is that the region is not homogenous.
No.
So UAE is not the same as Saudi Arabia, not the same as Kuwait. They're all part of the Gulf Cooperation Council, but you may as well be talking about England, France, and Argentina, because every country has its own way of doing things, certain nuances. You've got to take this into account. You've got to study the requirements and needs of each market, rather than saying, well, if I'm going to partner with XYZ company in UAE, I'll use the same partner in Saudi.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen with an Australian company a long time ago, and it just didn't work, because that company, who is very well known and influential here in the UAE, has no standing in Saudi Arabia, or very little standing.
This is a question that I'm often asked, and it's the language question. I mean, English is widely spoken, so that's not the issue. But how important is it to have Arabic?
It depends what you're doing. It depends in what setting you're in. So day-to-day business, I mean, with what I do, English is widely spoken. In board meetings, it's a combination of both. Now, if you're dealing with multinationals here, it's English. If you're dealing with certain government departments here, the conversation is English, but it depends on the level of English that you're dealing with. Generally, it's pretty good in the UAE, but then when you start dealing with documentation, all official documentation is in Arabic. Go a bit further afield to other parts of the region, Arabic becomes more important. It's not a showstopper, but it is important. Now, day to day, I mean, do you need to be fluent? The answer is no. Is it good to know a few key words? Absolutely. Why? It's not going to help you in terms of getting your point across, but it actually just comes across well. Because if someone's sitting there, you're making an effort, I'm telling you, someone will sit there and say, that's really nice that they made the effort.
Yes.
And that speaks volumes about what you want to do, how genuine you are, and how committed you are.
That's lovely. Earlier, you focused on the transformation of Dubai's education system. What are the challenges that have been faced, and what's been done to address them?
The challenges were actually quite great. I mean, you go back to 2010, I mean, there really wasn't a comprehensive private education system here. So it was started from scratch, wow. Which is fantastic in terms of having a clean slate, because you can draw on the best bits of different parts of the world to build a world-class system. And the idea was to build that system that caters for all needs, all curricula, all price points, and also cultural considerations, for example, segregation and other matters in that regard. If you fast forward to today, it's probably arguable that Dubai has the most unique private education system in the world. There are 210 private schools here, wow. With 300,000 students. There is every curricula you could imagine: UK, IB, US, Indian, Japanese, French, Australian, even Danish. So we are sport for choice here. And that ranges across the entire spectrum of tuition fees as well. And the facilities here are generally very good in terms of the physical infrastructure, and they are spread well geographically, but also demographically as well. And so what that means is that wherever you live, you will have access within 15 to 20 minutes of a school of your choice that meets your budget, that meets your pedagogical requirements. So that's actually quite an achievement.
That's phenomenal. Turning to the focus of building its economic assets, what have you observed about how sovereign funds operate, and what opportunities do you think they offer specifically for Australia?
Look, we're all aware of situations where sovereign funds from this region, particularly the UAE, have invested in Australia, whether it's utilities, infrastructure, property, and that's documented. But that's only a small microcosm. It's an opportunity to partner with sophisticated investors that definitely know their target markets. They take a long-term view, as I mentioned earlier. They are definitely not what I would call sleepy or passive repositories of capital.
Right.
They're well-oiled machines. They're very shrewd boards and executive teams, and analysts who have worked in some of the largest investment banks and financial institutions around the world.
Right.
And they have what I call a patient capital approach, but also they can move quickly if they have to. And that's the advantage. Regardless of what sector, what industry you're in, there will always be an opportunity to partner in that regard, regardless of your risk appetite, regardless of the stage you are at in terms of your growth. So that's definitely something which companies should bear in mind. It's not just one or the other.
Right. So the UAE is Australia's largest Middle East trading partner, and you sit on the management committee, and you're also a strategic advisor for the New South Wales chapter at the Australian Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry. What are the expectations and the potential successful outcomes in terms of opportunities, mobility, sustainability themes for participating in the upcoming Expo 2020? We were reading about this recently, and it just seemed like a tremendous opportunity for Australians.
Yeah, and look, pre-COVID, I mean, everything was full steam ahead in terms of preparing for Expo, not only in terms of the infrastructure, which was pretty much almost done, but also in terms of the representation of the different countries, and Australia is obviously a significant part of that. The representation is across a few sectors, and a lot of that's already been secured. Investment, agri, innovation, education, financial services and tourism. So that's locked in. The interesting thing is that now that Expo has been postponed to October next year because of COVID, it actually gives those companies who've already committed an opportunity, to refine their offering, not just generally, but in the context of what's happened in the last few months globally. What it also does, it gives other companies an opportunity to think about participating. Those who, had maybe not thought about participating previously because they thought maybe what they do is not relevant. But now, there is, everything has changed. And I think that those companies who have an offering which is basically underpinned by, as I mentioned before, a technology stack, something that has a good online presence, and not only that, where they can actually implement and follow up in terms of their offering remotely. That is what would actually speak volumes here, because it engenders efficiencies, it engenders cost effectiveness, and it really demonstrates a model that is relatively resilient, should something like this happen again, or another external shock for that matter. So I think that this time now is actually going to be used quite effectively.
It's interesting because as I was sitting here and you were making the observation about the 12-month lead time for the next one and being able to encourage more Australian business to get involved, we should absolutely look for opportunities to showcase and to create a dialogue between many of the high growth startups that aren't thinking about the UAE, and you and I have been talking about ways to do that. So I'm quite looking forward to that. Just in terms of governance, you mentioned, Australia's governance rules are quite sophisticated, very well articulated. You're involved with the AICD quite substantially, and they're a partner of Advance, so we love them very much. How do you see having governance and the issues raised by the AICD making an impact in the region, and most importantly, what is it that Australian boards need to understand?
So the AICD's approach when it comes to this part of the world is quite simple. I mean, the aim is to engender fundamental principles of governance and the operation of boards that can be universally applied. So we take a global approach, particularly with those entities that have operations across different markets. And Now, there are a number of governance and director institutes in the region which are very much locally focused, and we work with them. So what we do is complementary to what they do. It's not competitive at all. The other thing we try to espouse or promote is that, governance is contextual. It has to be adapted to suit different types of entities. There's no one size fits all. So whether you're talking about a government entity, a private company, a family office, you need to shape or mould the governance and board operational structures to fit that. It's not a case of saying, well, this is what we do in Australia, so we'll do it here. Number one, it may not be relevant. Number two, it may not be culturally appropriate either. So then you just be implementing it for the sake of implementing it, but it actually wouldn't have any impact. So that's also what we try to encourage. When it comes to board dynamics, we look at, exerting influence in the boardroom. And this, takes a couple, it's either hard or soft influence. And that will depend on looking at the characteristics or the mannerisms of each board member, how they interact as a group, what agendas they have. But in all of that, it's about building, trust and rapport amongst the board. And that is something that we stress takes time. It needs to be treated very carefully. And you need to know, as I said, when to pull and push. That's the hard and the soft influence.
Yes.
And that's critical, because boards are a different animal to what they are in Australia and other parts of the world. So it comes back to what I said about being contextual, and it's taking the body of knowledge that the Institute has and picking out those parts which we think really could be relevant.
That's fantastic. And one of my last questions for you is in relation to some of the things you've learned and watched and observed in the UAE, how do you think they can assist Australian business? What can we learn?
Look, as I said before, when people come here to do business, they think that they will teach people here what to do. But there are actually some things that we can learn, and there are things that are done here which are done well, which could be useful in Australia. There's probably three things I would say. The first thing is around agricultural technologies.
Yes.
And I think that is important because the climate here is very arid and dry and harsh, which is similar to Australia. So they have similar challenges here, and that plays very well in terms of food security, land and water management.
Right.
So that's one area. I think, as I mentioned before, the UAE has embraced the fourth industrial revolution as a key part of its development. So the work that's being done here in terms of artificial intelligence and its application to different industries could definitely be relevant. I mean, there's even a dedicated ministry here for artificial intelligence.
Right.
So that highlights the importance that they place on that. And I think probably the final area is what I would call smart government initiatives or e-government initiatives, engendering efficiencies within the operation of government, to push as much as they can in terms of functions and services online. The aim is, for example, for the Dubai government to be paperless by 2021, which is not that far away. And they will achieve that. And probably what's happened in the last few months will help accelerate that. It's important because it shows that, the government here is adopting the same level of professionalism, the same standards that the private sector would adopt in their operations. And that also bodes well in terms of partnerships between the public and private sector.
Well, the beauty of that, of course, is that they're able to, as they move things onto the digital platforms, they're able to then do a review of the service delivery. They're able to increase the level of straight-through processing. You can have humans deal with the exceptions rather than the cases. You can have a complete new look at the platforms that you set everything on. And then, of course, the gold mine, which is really the data that allows you to re-examine your strategies and your policies. And then when you open that up, your APIs, you're able to then impact product development and new opportunities in ways that you haven't before, just because of the rich pool of data. So I think that's just extraordinary.
Absolutely. And it all comes back to data. It all comes back to not only creating repositories of data, but how you use that. And everything that's done here, whether it's online or otherwise, is data driven. Because
because you mentioned also the AI. Once you've got the data, the machine learning can then move into the next stage of AI development. So you're suddenly, the machine is coming back to you with options that you hadn't considered. So it's just wonderful.
And that's a big part of, for example, what entities like the Dubai Future Foundation are looking at,
right,
amongst other things. So that will continue to play an increasingly important role.
So if we were to go on if there were 3 or 4 entities that somebody wanted to familiarise themselves in terms of the future strategy of Dubai, where would they go? You've just mentioned the Future Institute there. What are the others that they would be searching for?
So probably the Dubai Future Foundation is one. The Mohammed bin Rashid Innovation Fund is another entity that's doing some great things. There is an entity called Dubai SME, which is set up to support the SME sector in traditional and let's say more futuristic ways in terms of their growth. Other entities, I mean, they would be the main 3, I would say, yes.
Adam, this has been a tremendous conversation. I'm so thrilled to have had you join us today. I'm looking forward to the day when you come and visit in person, or when we come and visit you in person, and Dubai's gain is our loss. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we love the fact that you've maintained your relationship with Australia so actively, proving that you can live anywhere and still have a very close relationship with home.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maria. I appreciate it.
Thank you.